Hey, 42 here. During the Second World War, an old stately home in southern England called Bletchley Park became the home of the Allies' top secret team of elite codebreakers. Their task was simple: unscramble the contents of the encoded communications being sent all over the world in their millions by the Nazis. These codebreakers were some of the brightest men and women in the whole of Britain, hand-picked by British intelligence for their mathematical and linguistic brilliance. And yet, even in this exalted company, one man stood comfortably head and shoulders above the rest. Today, we know him as one of the founding fathers of the computer, as the first pioneer of artificial intelligence, and as the man who broke the unbreakable Enigma machine. A feat that, according to some historians, ended the Second World War years early and saved millions of lives in the process. This is the story of Alan Matheson Turing, one of the greatest thinkers, not just of recent times, but of all time. But this isn't your run-of-the-mill, rare genius does cool stuff kind of tale, because Turing's story contains just as much tragedy as it does triumph. Just 7 years after the end of the war, he helped win. Alan Turing was branded a criminal by his own government and subjected to a barbaric medical procedure known as chemical castration. 2 years after that, at the age of just 41, he would be dead in what I can only describe as unusual circumstances. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Alan Turing was born in Maida Vale, London, in the June of 1912. A textbook child prodigy, his remarkable intellect was apparent from a very young age, with the word genius being bandied about as early as primary school. That genius, as well as his family's distant ties to the British aristocracy, saw Alan end up in Sherborne, one of Britain's most prestigious schools. It's also one of the oldest, having been in continuous operation for a frankly ridiculous 1,300 years. To say that Alan was keen on his studies would be a bit of an understatement. His first day at school happened to fall during the General Strike of 1926, which pretty much shut down public transport across the whole of Britain. Your average schoolboy would have been absolutely delighted by this unexpected excuse to bunk off. But Alan Turing was anything but average. Rather than chill at home watching Netflix, he decided to tackle the 60-mile journey to his new school on the back of his trusty bicycle, arriving punctually for his first day after an overnight stop in an inn. He was 13 at the time. Turing went on to study mathematics at King's College, Cambridge, where he continued to wow pretty much everyone he met. He graduated with first-class honours, naturally, and was made a fellow at the age of just 22. 2 years later, while studying for his PhD at Princeton, he published one of the most influential mathematics papers in history on computable numbers with an application to the Entscheidungs problem. The paper basically gave birth to an entirely new field of study, computer science. And, though you may not be too familiar with its title, there's a good chance you've heard of the paper's most groundbreaking idea: the universal Turing machine. A Turing machine is a simple device consisting of a scanner and an infinite tape divided up into squares, performing actions like writing or deleting a symbol based on a predefined set of instructions. Turing never planned for such a machine to be made. It was simply a clever thought experiment designed to advance mathematical theory. But, as it happens, it was much more than that. Today, we know the universal Turing machine as the first ever model for what we would now call a computer. Turing left Princeton to return to life in Cambridge in 1939. He'd always been interested in code breaking, and being a genius, he was pretty good at it too. So good, in fact, that he'd even done a bit of consultancy work at the British Government Code and Cipher School, the organisation now known as GCHQ. When Britain declared war on Germany on the 3rd of September 1939, there was only one place for a man like Alan: Bletchley Park. He reported promptly for duty the very next day after hostilities commenced. If you've ever seen the film The Imitation Game, which tells the story of Turing's time at Bletchley, you'll probably have an idea of him as a bit of an arrogant bellend. But the film does him a disservice. There's no denying Turing was pretty eccentric. He famously used to wear a gas mask whilst riding his bike to Bletchley Park during the summer to keep his hay fever at bay. But according to the people who knew him best, he was also charming, funny, friendly, and popular, if a little shy and socially awkward. Anyway, during the war, he'd make a whole host of important cryptanalytical breakthroughs at Bletchley Park. But right from the outset, his main focus was clear: defeating the Nazis' Enigma machine. It's a little known fact that the famous machine was actually invented a good 20 years before the war. But there's a very good reason for its longevity. Put simply, Enigma was the most advanced encryption device in existence. Having said that, operating this formidable machine was actually pretty straightforward. All you had to do was type your message out on a typewriter-style keyboard, then note down the corresponding ciphertext that would flash up on the device's light panel after each keystroke. Decoding was equally simple. Type the ciphertext out on the keyboard and the original message would magically flash up on the light panel. There was one small catch though. This neat little process only worked if your Enigma machine was configured with exactly the same settings as the machine on which the message had been encoded in the first place. And that was a problem, because the Enigma machine had approximately 159 quintillion possible settings. That's a number so big it sounds like I made it up for effect. It's also so big that it's pretty much impossible for our puny human brains to grasp. But if you were to stack 159 quintillion human hairs side by side, not end to end, side by side, your creepy tower of hair would be about 1.6 light years high. Not that that little comparison actually helped all that much, because the scale of a light year is also impossible for our puny human brains to grasp. But you get the idea. 159 quintillion is a lot. If you didn't know the exact settings needed to decode your Enigma encrypted message, the only way to crack the cipher was to try those 159 quintillion different options one by one. To make matters even worse, German High Command changed the settings of their Enigma machines on a daily basis. So it wasn't just a case of cracking Enigma once. To gain consistent intelligence, you had to beat it every single day, over and over again. For this reason, it was widely believed that defeating the Enigma machine wasn't merely a challenging cryptography problem, but a literal impossibility. There was, however, one tiny sliver of silver lining skirting the edges of this giant Nazi black cloud. German High Command had such unshakable trust in the strength of Enigma that they used it for all of their most important communications, including orders given by Hitler himself. That meant that breaking Enigma would give the Allies, well, everything. Battle plans, information on supplies, and the position of every ship and U-boat in the entire Nazi fleet. To put that another way, if the Allies could beat the Enigma machine, they'd win the war. One thing I'd like to point out is that Turing didn't break Enigma all on his lonesome. As I've already said, he had a team of brilliant individuals working with him at Bletchley Park. He also had the work of Polish code breakers, like Marian Warewski, to build on. Warewski had actually cracked a simpler version of Enigma before the war had even started, and Polish intelligence passed a huge amount of that invaluable knowledge on to the Allies. Still, Turing was undoubtedly the driving force behind the work at Bletchley Park, and without his ideas, it's highly unlikely the significantly more complex versions of Enigma that were introduced during the war would ever have been broken. Exactly how he succeeded deserves an entire video of its own, but in a nutshell, Turing and his team built a machine called the bomb. based on an earlier Polish design, that helped sift through possible enigma settings orders of magnitude faster than a human ever could. Turing's revolutionary methods also exploited small weaknesses, both in the enigma machines themselves, like the fact no letter could be encoded as itself, and in the protocols followed by the German soldiers who used them, like the fact that certain words were often used at the start of multiple messages, to greatly speed up the process. Ultimately, Enigma was beaten, and the Allies had gained a weapon of almost limitless power. But, as any comic book scholar knows, with great power comes great responsibility. And the intelligence gathered from decrypted Enigma messages was no exception. Adolf Hitler was many things, most of which would get this video instantly demonetized if I was to utter them out loud, but one thing he wasn't was a fool. If the Allies suddenly started responding to Hitler's plans, even before he executed them, he would be forced to reach one of two conclusions. Either Winston Churchill and co. had somehow figured out how to tell the future, or they'd broken Enigma. If Hitler ever realized the truth, not one single message would ever be sent using Enigma again. But the Allies came up with some pretty ingenious ways to keep the breakthrough a secret, only ever acting on intelligence when they could engineer a convincing enough cover story. For example, if an Enigma message detailing an upcoming attack on a supply convoy was intercepted, instead of just sending in a load of destroyers to obliterate those enemy ships, the Allies would dispatch spotter planes to fly over the area, even though they already knew where it was, so that any enemy survivors of the resulting battle would believe they'd been sighted legitimately. To make things even more convincing, spotter planes were even sent to fly over areas where the Allies knew the enemy wasn't. It's hard to estimate exactly what impact breaking of the Enigma had on the war, but several historians have tried. The most often quoted figures suggest that Turing's efforts ended the war at least 2 years early, saving 14 million lives in the process. Some have even gone further, claiming that without Turing, the Allies would not have won the war at all. Just think about that for a second. Military superpowers all over the world were waging the biggest war in history, with tanks, bombers, artillery shells, machine guns, and something like 127 million soldiers. And yet, one geeky mathematician working in secret in an English stately home changed the course of the war in a manner that no weight of bombs or guns ever could have. As I've already mentioned, despite this truly monumental feat, after the war, Turing wasn't given the praise he so richly deserved. Admittedly, he was awarded with an OBE, but the remarkable work he carried out at Bletchley Park would remain a state secret for almost 30 years. Instead of basking in the glory of being one of Britain's greatest ever war heroes, Turing simply went back to work, making important breakthroughs in computing, artificial intelligence, and mathematical biology. It's impossible to know what intellectual gifts he might have offered the world had he been given just a little more time. But Turing's personal hourglass was already fast running out of sand. The beginning of the end came with his arrest in 1952 for what was known at the time as gross indecency. Today, we call it being a homosexual. Turing had never been particularly discreet about his sexuality, and after a break-in at his home, he admitted to the investigating officers that he'd been in a sexual relationship with one of the men involved. To an open-minded citizen of the 21st century, sexual orientation is a complete non-issue. In Turing's time, it was illegal. He pleaded guilty at the ensuing trial, and the judge gave him two options. Turing could spend 2 years in jail, or undergo a medical treatment known as chemical castration to cure his affliction. He opted for the latter, and for the following 12 months he was forced to endure regular estrogen injections designed to eliminate his sex drive. This barbaric and dehumanizing excuse for justice rendered Turing impotent and caused his breast tissue to enlarge, along with a whole host of other unpleasant side effects. To make matters even worse, the criminal conviction meant Turing's security clearance was revoked, barring him from working in British intelligence ever again. 2 years after his arrest, at the age of just 41, Alan Matheson Turing was dead, found sprawled on the floor of his home by the housekeeper. In the inquest that followed, it was determined that he died of cyanide poisoning in an apparent suicide. To this day, that remains the most widely accepted version of events, that, traumatized by the brutal and uncaring treatment afforded to him by the very government he'd given so much, he took his own life. But it turns out that conclusion is anything but certain. For one thing, the timings don't really make sense. Turing's suicide is almost always mentioned in the same breath as his conviction for gross indecency, and the barbaric chemical castration that followed, with the implication being clear. This so-called treatment was Turing's motive for taking his own life. In reality, the estrogen injections had ended a full year before Turing's death. And most of the people who knew him in those days claim he bore the indignity of the whole sorry affair remarkably well. Of course, it's impossible to say whether that was all just a bit of stiff upper lipping from a man who preferred to do his suffering in private. But there are a few curious details about the case that put suicide in further doubt as the cause of death. A half-eaten apple was found beside Turing's body, and it was assumed he'd laced it with cyanide before eating it. Rumour has it he'd always been fascinated by the poisoned apple from Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, but the apple was never actually tested for traces of cyanide. It's also interesting that Turing didn't leave a suicide note of any kind, and that a to-do list of tasks lined up for the following few days was found on his desk. But if not suicide, then what? Turing used his box-like spare room as a kind of mini lab. And he'd recently ordered electroplating equipment so he could gold plate his spoons. I told you he was eccentric. Interestingly enough, the process involved the use of potassium cyanide to dissolve the gold, leading some people to suggest that Turing did indeed kill himself, but entirely unintentionally by breathing in cyanide fumes as he worked. There is, of course, another possibility. Alan Turing knew a great number of dangerous secrets. And as the Second World War had proven, that man was a weapon. Or at least, his mind was. During his time at Bletchley Park, Turing wrote 2 papers on cryptanalysis that were considered so vital to British national security, they weren't made public until 2012. Turing also had plenty of reasons to feel wronged by a government he'd served so faithfully, and it isn't beyond the realms of possibility that someone in a position of power decided that was a dangerous enough combination to eliminate it entirely. You know, just to be on the safe side. It's an interesting theory, though beyond the obvious motive, there isn't any evidence to back it up. Whatever the truth, one thing we know for certain is that Turing's death at the age of 41 was a tragedy. This was a man who quite literally changed the world. He prevented untold suffering by bringing the Second World War to an end years early, and his insights gave birth to arguably the most influential invention of the last few centuries, the computer. It wasn't until September of 2009 that Turing was given a formal apology from the British government. And 4 years later, he was officially pardoned by the Queen herself. In 2017, a new law, commonly called the Alan Turing Law, was introduced, in which all of the almost 50,000 men who were charged with gross indecency were pardoned for their crime. Just another small way the remarkable Alan Turing changed our world for the better. Thanks for watching.